Hey, what's up, 8th graders? This is Miss Ludwig. We are doing your MB4 notes on the cell cycle and mitosis today, which is on page 8 in your lab notebook. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the process of mitosis, but also understand that mitosis is not the whole cell cycle. So just like any living thing has a life cycle from beginning to end, each one of your cells also has a life cycle, and we call it the cell cycle. So before we get talking too much about all of this fancy stuff, we need to talk about what are chromosomes. We're going to use the words chromosomes and chromatin a lot when we talk about the cell cycle and dividing, creating new cells. So chromosomes are actually a double rod of condensed chromatin. So this is in the nucleus of your cells. We know that the nucleus is the control center. It contains the DNA and tells the rest of the cell what to do. So inside the nucleus is something called chromatin, which is really just squished up DNA. It's kind of stringy-like, located in the nucleus. And during the process of the cell cycle, that chromatin kind of becomes organized into chromosomes. And chromosomes are typically represented as this X shape. So chromosomes, as you can see in this picture, they just have DNA. They contains your genes and the information for who you are. So again, in the nucleus, we find the DNA. Chromatin, chromosomes, when you think of those words, you need to think about DNA. Okay, so cell division. The very first stage in cell division is called interphase. So this is before mitosis actually happens. Interphase is a super important part of the cell cycle because in order for a cell to divide properly, it has to do all this stuff in interphase before it can actually divide properly. So interphase is actually the longest part of the cell cycle, which I will show you in a moment. So it's the period before the cell actually divides into new cells. During this phase is when cells grow bigger. They are copying the organelles, so all the basic parts of the cells that you're familiar with, like the mitochondria, like the endoplasmic reticulum, like the Golgi bodies. All of those parts of the cells are being copied so that there's a second set of them. So when the cell divides, that new cell has all the same parts. And then, of course, a really important part is the DNA. The genetic material that's in your cells and makes you who you are is replicating or creating a new copy of itself so it can share it with the new cell. Here's a picture that kind of shows you the whole life cycle, or what we call the cell cycle, from beginning to end. So just like you have a lifespan from beginning to end, so does a cell. It starts up here at the top and it goes all the way around this way, clockwise. So this whole part that's in yellow where the cell is growing, the DNA is being replicated and preparing for division, all of this in yellow is actually interphase. So that's the beginning steps of cells dividing. So we grow for 9 hours, we make new DNA copies, we prepare and copy all of our organelles, and then this blue section, which is only just part of the cell cycle, is where we're actually dividing and creating new cells. And then the very last part, after we've copied everything and made new nuclei, we have cytokinesis, where the cytoplasm actually divides into 2 brand new cells that are identical to the original cell. So here we have mitosis. Mitosis is also made up of several parts, but this is stage 2 of the whole cell cycle, is what we call mitosis. So during mitosis is where we're actually creating a new nucleus inside the cell, and it's going to happen in body cells. So your body cells are the cells that make up your body. They are cells that make up your skin, your hair, your muscles, the cells that make up your heart and your lungs, any kind of body cell is where mitosis is going to happen. Mitosis is the process of just dividing and creating a new nucleus so that your body can continue to grow and repair itself. Here's a picture of the whole process of the cell cycle and mitosis, but as you can see, you're starting with one cell, and by the end of the whole cell cycle, you end up with 2 new identical cells. Now remember that the whole process of mitosis is actually occurring in the nucleus. And if you remember, inside the nucleus, we contain that DNA, where we have the chromatin now has condensed into this X figure, which we call a chromosome. Again, just think DNA. What makes your cells what they are. So that is the definition of mitosis. Now we're going to talk about the steps involved in mitosis. So the very first step in the process of mitosis, the process of making new cells for your body, is prophase. Prophase is where the chromatin condenses to form those chromosomes. So that stringy DNA material that's inside the nucleus is getting organized at this point and becoming those X-shaped chromosomes that we're used to seeing. So this is an animation over here of what it looks like because it's a little bit easier to see what's happening during prophase, but this is a real cell underneath a microscope, and it looks very similar. This darker purple in here, this is inside the nucleus, and this is where we have our DNA, our chromatin, is forming those X-shaped chromosomes. Step 2 in the process of mitosis is called metaphase. If you remember, your stem meta actually means middle, which will help you significantly remember what's happening during metaphase. Metaphase is the second step of mitosis where your chromosomes, those X-like shapes, are lining up in the middle of the cell. All right, we're getting ready to start splitting and dividing. So the chromosomes have to line up in the middle of the cell. We have these little spindle fibers that are connected to them that are actually going to start pulling apart the chromosomes. And again, in your real life example, this dark purple here is showing you that these chromosomes are lining up in the middle of the cell. Our next step is anaphase. During anaphase, we had those spindle fibers that were attaching to those X-shaped chromosomes, and they're actually splitting them apart into 2 different sets. Okay? So during anaphase, the chromosomes are actually separating into opposite sides of the cell. Normally our cells are pretty round, but during anaphase, we kind of stretch out into this kind of oval, egg-shaped cell because they're stretching and preparing to get ready to make a new cell. Then our last step of mitosis is called telophase. Telophase is where we make a new nucleus inside the cell. So as you can see in our picture here, we kind of get a figure 8 shaped cell because it's starting to want to make a new cell divide. But right now, during this last step of mitophase, telophase, which is the end step of mitosis, is where I have 2 new nuclei forming. So this little black shape is showing you that a new nuclear envelope is forming, and we have half of the chromosomes in here. And then over here we have a second nucleus that is forming with the other half of the DNA. Remember, these are exactly the same. We've literally just split it in half. In our real life version, again, this dark purple here is the new DNA in one nucleus and the new DNA in the other nucleus. After telophase ends, that's the end of mitosis, but our big finale is cytokinesis. So cytokinesis is where we actually take the one cell that has two nuclei in it now and dividing it into 2 separate cells. So during that process, we need for the cytoplasm to divide. So we call this the parent cell. That's like the original cell that's dividing. This would be the step of telophase in mitosis. I have 2 new nuclei. I have all my copies of my organelles and all of my genetic material, an exact copy. And then cytokinesis is the last stage of the whole cell cycle, where I actually am dividing this cytoplasm and creating an entirely new cell. So at the beginning of the cell cycle, I have 1 cell. During interphase, we copy everything. Then mitosis, we make sure everything is divided evenly and identically. And then cytokinesis is the end where we actually split and form 2 new identical daughter cells. Again, we just call them daughter cells because this is our original parent cell. And when we divide them, these are the new cells that were created, daughter cells. Okay, and it's important also because we talk so much about DNA and the genes and the chromatin and the chromosomes to talk a little bit about the structure of DNA or how your DNA is put together. And you may already know this, but the word DNA actually stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, which is really fancy, but we just say DNA. The shape of DNA is like a ladder. So we have the edge parts of the ladder here. And then we have these little rungs. This would be the part where you would put your feet to climb higher. And then it gets twisted. So it's not a straight ladder. It's a twisted double helix, we call it. That's just kind of the way that we talk about DNA. DNA is made up of deoxyribose sugar and also phosphates. And it has some nitrogen bases. So those nitrogen bases, because the basis of all life is actually chemistry, it's coming back to you again. These nitrogen bases have some fancy names, and it helps the DNA line up correctly in your cells. So the 4 nitrogen bases are guanine, cytosine, adenine, and thymine. And we represent those with just the first letter. So as you can see here, we always have our guanine and our cytosine, the G and the C, are always connected. And also our adenine and our thymine are also always connected. So during parts of your cell cycle, your DNA will kind of unzip itself. So it'll have two different sides, and then a new part comes on when we develop those new cells. We need the other half of our DNA, and so it knows how to line up correctly based on these nitrogen bases. Remember, G to C and A to T. It is always like that, and if it's not, it's caused some kind of mutation in your DNA or some changes in your DNA that might cause you some problems down the road. Okay, and then at the bottom of your note page, you actually have this exact same picture. I'm going to show you what's going on in this picture. I'm going to give you a little memory device that you might already know to help remember the stages of the process of mitosis. And then we're going to answer the analysis questions just to make sure we're all on the same page with mitosis and the whole cell cycle. So this is the process of mitosis. Again, it happens in the nucleus. We have these 4 phases: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And right up here, this is just showing you what these parts of the cell are. So this outside circle is the cell membrane. Of course, it determines what comes in and out of the cell. It is selectively permeable. We have the centrosomes and the microtubules. The microtubules help kind of move things around in the cell. The centrosomes will actually help hold your chromosomes together at one point. Then we have the inside circle here, which is the nucleus, and all that squiggly stuff in there, of course, is your genetic material, your DNA or chromatin. So during the process of mitosis, we have that whole beginning phase that's interphase, where the cell is growing and copying everything in it, and then we begin the actual division part, the mitosis. So in order to remember the process, kind of in order and what happens during each process, we have some hand gestures. And depending on your 7th grade science teacher, you might have seen this before. So prophase is the first phase, and we kind of hold our hands, let's see if you can hold this, up in a kind of a praying motion. And really, prophase is more of a circle. It should probably look more like this. But we always put our hands together just this way in 7th grade because it helps you remember the beginning. Pro is forward or beginning. So pro is the first one, prophase is the first one, and it starts with P, and so does pray. So we kind of always start our hands this way. Then, so prophase is where we have our chromatin condenses into those X-shaped chromosomes and it kind of organizes itself. Then during metaphase, those chromosomes line up in the middle. So where my hands are connecting here in the middle, that's representing the chromosomes lining up in the middle. Meta means middle. Then we have anaphase, where those chromosomes are being pulled apart by those spindle fibers and stretching out to opposite sides of the cell. And then telophase is where I'm creating my 2 new nuclei. Remember, the cell has not split yet. We've just made 2 new nuclei with the same genetic material in them. So one more time, that's prophase is the beginning where I make chromosomes. Metaphase, the chromosomes line up in the middle. Anaphase, they stretch out to opposite sides of the cell. And then telophase, we have 2 new nuclei. Then we know that to completely end that whole cell cycle, then we need to have cytokinesis, which is where I actually make my 2 brand new daughter cells. And I know they're kind of behind my head here, but you have 2 new, brand new cells completely split apart from each other. So let's go through the analysis questions. Make sure you answer these on bottom of page 8. Number 1 says, how many cells do you start out with at the beginning of the cell cycle? Well, you start out with just 1 cell. Now, it's important to note that this whole cell cycle and mitosis is happening in your body all the time with 1,000 different cells, more than 1,000 cells. They're just happening all the time, but when we think about this whole process, we want to think about 1 cell at a time. So we're starting with 1, we call it a parent cell. Number 2, what part of the cell does mitosis take place in? It starts in the nucleus, right? That's where the DNA is contained. The genetic material of your cell is in the nucleus of the cell. Number 3 says, what is the end result of mitosis? Not the end result of the whole cell cycle, but just mitosis. During telophase, the end result of mitosis is we have 2 new nuclei that contain the exact same information for the cell. So 1 cell with 2 identical nuclei. They are exact copies of each other. Number 4 says, how many cells do you have at the end of the whole cell cycle? The end of the cell cycle during cytokinesis, we end up with 2 brand new cells. Again, they are identical to each other. And lastly, number 5, what is the end result of the cell cycle? So at the end of the cell cycle, we're going to have 2 separate but identical cells, and we call those the daughter cells. Okay, well that is mitosis and the whole cell cycle. Thanks for watching.